Lopez Levy, who I will introduce right away. Dr. Lopez Levy has a doctoral degree in international studies from the Joseph Corbel School of International Studies of the University of Denver, and he has also a master's degree in economics from Carleton University in Ottawa, and also in international affairs from Columbia University at New York City. Dr. Lopez Levy got his bachelor degree at the Higher Institute of International Relations in Israel. And Dr. Lopez Levy was also a visiting assistant professor of international relations at the Gustavus Adolphus College in Minnesota. In the spring of 2020, Dr. Lopez Levy was a Fulbright visiting professor at the Universidad Autónoma de Madrid. And of course, Dr. Lopez Levy is also the author of the book Raúl Castro and the New Cuba, A Close-Up View of Change. He has been a fellow of the Inter-American Dialogue, the Aspen Institute Software Society, and a consultant for the New American Foundation. In 2005, Dr. Lopez Levy received the Leonard Marks Foreign Policy Award of the American Academy of Diplomacy. He has written several articles about Cuba, Latin America, the U.S. policy towards Latin America, different journals such as Foreign Policy in Focus, the Chicago Tribune as well, the Florida Sun Sentinel, the Baltimore Sun, Tampa Bay Times, and the Miami Herald, among many other newspapers. And he's also an analyst for CNN Spanish and a guest at radio and TV programs in the US. So thank you very much, Dr. Arturo Lopez Levy, for being with us. Just a brief reminder on how this webinar is going to be conducted. Dr. Lopez Levy will start his presentation. He will be speaking for some 20 to 25 minutes. After that, he will be able to answer some of the questions raised by the audience. During that time, we will be collecting such questions through our chat. And well, we encourage you all to post your questions in either English or Spanish. And after that, we will have a brief chat on these answers and on these questions and answers. So just as a reminder, this event is going to be recorded. And well, thank you very much, Dr. Arturo Lopez Levy. The stage is yours from now on.
Thank you very much, Mauricio. I want to thank you, Jorge and Rafael, for reaching to me and ask me if we could have this conversation. Always is a pleasure to be in contact with people that do Latin American studies in other places, and particularly given the prestige that Latin American studies in the United Kingdom has, is an additional reason for accepting your invitation. Let me say a few things that basically establish the basic framework that I use to analyze Cuba, and then I'm going to touch on the issue of legitimacy and this phase of reforms that are taking place in Cuba that have received the name of Ordenamiento. Let me say that there might be a problem at some point on the transmission. I have a very little, my daughter is only 6 months old, and at times she wants to join us to discuss issues on these type of online discussions. And you might hear a baby crying or expressing happiness from time to time. So let me talk about my view about Cuba and how to study Cuba. And from there, we're going to go on. I think that the big issue in the studies of Cuba had been that at times people has tried to look at Cuba as an exceptional country in Latin America. And basically, they have tried to build a theory about Cuba that it begins from the premise that let's try to see this country in its merit as something different from the rest of the region of the Caribbean or Latin America at large. And it is true that Cuba has some particular exceptional dimensions. It's the last country that achieved independence from Spain. It also went through a process of closeness and tying with US society for the first half of the 20th century that was preceded by an economic dominance of the Cuban economy before even the US intervention in 1898. It is true that beginning in the second half of the 20th century, Cuba went under the process of the establishment of a communist regime. But beyond that, there is a theory, a political science theory, an economic, a political economy theory, that it is very useful to study Cuba. And that's why I think that the idea of the exception should be the last resource, and we should begin by using as much as possible the tools that we have, even if we are dealing with the exceptional circumstances that characterize Cuba. The topic that we are going to cover here talk about political legitimacy. And when we are going to talk about political legitimacy in Cuba, it is important to locate the discussion in the subset of non-liberal democratic regimes. And this is very important because there has been a lot of research about communism, but also about authoritarian, post-totalitarian adaptation in the context of these types of regimes, fundamentally in areas such as East Asia, particularly Chinese studies and Vietnamese studies. And here is where I think it is a topic that there in the study of those regimes in China and Vietnam, not in the case of North Korea, that in my opinion is a case on itself, in which people has tried to explain the issue of political legitimacy, political adaptation, political resilience, on the idea that there are forms of political legitimacy beyond the idea of free and fair and competitive elections. And here there are several authors. I will mention among them, for instance, Brantley Womack, that has studied the issue of modernization in these countries, or German political scientist Gunther Schober, that they put the emphasis on the building of zones of legitimacy that are associated with areas beyond the electoral exercise. And the main concern is not to dismiss or to disqualify as illegitimate a regime just because it is not, or it doesn't enjoy the stamp of free, competitive, multi-party elections. That's why, in general, people put a difference, including Al Stepan and Juan Lins, in their studies on democratization, between the concept of liberalization, where there is a significant expansion of rights or zones of predictable performance and predictable arrangement of coercive authority that are beyond that provide the regimes a significant level of approval, or at least acquiescence and acceptance among the population, beyond the idea of a competitive democratic game or something like that. So let me land this in the context of Cuba in specific. And I would say, for instance, that, well, as Philippe Schmitter did when he studied the issue of legitimacy in the context, for instance, of the European Union and other areas, it is very important to look at legitimacy in the particular context in which we are talking about. And in the context of Cuba, it is important to search which are those zones of legitimacy or legitimacy building by which, in the context of a non-democratic regime, a non-liberal democratic regime, this issue of legitimacy played a role. And let me begin by something that it is a well-known truth. It's the idea that the political system in Cuba is the result of an authentic radical revolution that happened in 1959. And I'm not going to make here a long story, but I want to call your attention that this revolution was associated with two important elements that were not connected originally to the idea of necessarily a communist outcome. And the first point that I'm going to make is the idea of nationalism and the idea of a regime or the establishment in Cuba of a political regime with a capacity to take off the control of Cuba or to rebel against what many Cubans see as a half century of humiliation after they fought for decades for their independence, and what they got was a republic that had a lot of merits, but it was characterized by the quote of Ambassador Earl Smith, one of the last US ambassadors in Cuba from the United States, who said that in Cuba before Castro, the US ambassador was the second man in charge most of the time, and in some cases, the most important person in the island. I don't think that this is a good characterization of the 50 years or the years between 1902 to 1959, but there was a clear element in the Cuban political culture. I will say that it was moving from the center right up to the radical left, in which there was an aspiration for a Cuba that could say no, and that could say no to foreign actors. And it began by the United States. The idea that Cuba should have a government that could build a capability to exercise its autonomous role, its sovereign role in the international system, and say no to the United States. The second element that I want to mention here is that the revolution had a big motivation on the topic of inequality. And although Cuba was quite modern for Latin American or even for Southern European standards by the 1950s, it has relatively good indicators in terms of poverty levels, for instance, health indicators. These indicators masked a tremendous level of inequality in terms of classes, race, and gender, and particularly along the urban-rural divide. So from the circumstances of the revolution and the pull and push that represented the conflict with the United States and the alliance with the Soviet Union, and eventually the adoption of a communist type of regime, emerged a Cuba that definitely was able to say no, and to say no not only to the United States, to say no to the Soviet Union, to say no to the People's Republic of China, to say no to the European powers, and now even at times to the European Union. And this is something that the revolution as a project and the political system that emerged after the revolution had enjoyed as an area of legitimacy, to say it in clear ways, as a project, as a paradigm, but also as a reality. The years with the support of the Soviet Union allow Cuba to build a very important penetrating in society, at times with a clear totalitarian nature, a big network of for healthcare and education, that it became also important zones of legitimacy for the political system. Here, I want to point out that this was accompanied, at least for 20 years, between 1970 and 1991, with a significant improvement in the standard of living of the population, although with a type of quality of life economically that you will not compare, let's say, with the technological levels that you will see in the United Kingdom, the United States, or countries, or let's say the type of standards that you will find in the upper middle classes of countries like Mexico, Argentina, Brazil, etc., in Latin America. We need to add that the creation of this space of equality and the important programs of access to education, healthcare, sports, etc., also create an environment of public security that it is also an important zone of legitimacy that compare with the crime rates that you find in the rest of the hemisphere, particularly in Latin America. I'm not talking about Canada, but even in the United States, it provides a type of political economy in which we can say that it will be a big mistake to look at the survival, the resilience of the Cuban regime, even after the collapse of the Soviet Union, 30 years after. It is important to look at these areas as an important source of resilience and resistance, adaptability in the case of a reservoir of legitimacy in the case of the Cuban government. Last but not least, I want to say that at least until 2006, even when the transition from a typical totalitarian, revolutionary, radical regime to a post-totalitarian phase was already well advanced, we need to take into account that even after that, even after the collapse of the Soviet Union, still the Cuban political system that originated in the revolution found an important pillar in the charismatic authority of Fidel Castro. Compared to the charisma of Fidel Castro, and this is very important because it's telling us also where the problems are coming. In addition to the zones of the reservoirs of legitimacy that I mentioned, we never should abandon the importance and relevance. Just 1 second. Necesito que no hagas tanto bulla porque me estoy desconcentrando aquí. The charisma as an important source of legitimacy, it is a factor that at times the people that has not lived the experience of a charismatic authority tend to neglect. And the charisma of Fidel Castro's charisma, was very important because it developed among the political base of the revolution a significant level of devotion and support for the man in the typical way that Max Weber looked at these characteristics. Even a radical change or a change on the basis from which the revolutionary discourse was made, was tolerated and accepted and supported by a base that look at him and even use phrases such as el caballo, the horse, or el comandante, looking at him not as a simple military leader, but as a political guy, a kind of pater figure that led the revolutionaries and, in some sense, the different brands of nationalism that converged, not only the communists, but other groups that converged on the idea of the political system that Cuba has. This is a good point to then look at what the regime is forced to adapt. And here we have to first to say that there is a tremendous economic crisis that was led to fester in some sense by the 30 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And here we must say that the Cuban government first, after the shock that represented close to 30% of the elimination suddenly of its trade and even its gross domestic product, took the response or adopted the response of making as little change as possible, but trying to adapt on the idea that it will come a better juncture. This is something that was reflected in the changes in the 1990s that tried to build a different model economically from the one of a typical command economy that existed before 1989. And here what we have is a persistence of command economy structures, but now complemented with some pockets of market-oriented segments that try to attract foreign investment and create areas for new employment with the so-called cuentapropismo or self-employment that allow people to do with flips and flops in the public policy to do some minor activities with very little space for employment. With very little space for economic activities. We are talking about small restaurants, reparation of clocks, taxi drivers, things like that. Obviously, it was difficult to keep those pockets surrounded by a wall in which those market dynamics didn't spill over to other areas of the economy. The other major change, because I don't want that you underestimate the transformative dimension of the 90s, was the opening to the use of the dollar. It was an opening to the use of hard currency, but it was basically the opening to the use of dollars, because the main source of hard currency for the country, in this case, beyond the official channels of exports or foreign direct investment or loans from other government, was remittances. In some sense, Cuba became more Latin American, more Caribbean, more Central American when it became a country highly dependent on the remittances from the diaspora. This obviously also had important connotations in the political economy of the country, because there were also important differences and gaps in terms of race and gender in the type of Cuban, the archetypical Cuban emigre. Particularly those who were in better economic position, that were the ones sending the remittances to Cuba, and also affecting the level of equality because of differences on the income and wealth created by the simply receiving of remittances from abroad. So here we have something that was the first response, but this response was unable to put the Cuban economy in a sustainable path, particularly after the collapse of the oil prices that brought down the economy that has become a kind of new life-saving connection for the Cuban political system, that was the particular alliance, the Bolivarian alliance that Cuba built with Hugo Chavez Venezuela in the first decade of the 21st century. So where do we are? Where we are basically in a moment in which we have this important economic crisis that is associated with the impossibility of sustaining the economic model that not only the one of the command economy, but the type of adaptation that came after. And also we are in a situation in which the crisis has lasted enough to deplete a significant part of the pool of the reservoir of legitimacy that was built during the golden years, golden between quote unquote, of the 1970 and the 1990s. There are new generations that they have lived all their life under the period of crisis. Obviously, with its ups and downs, because the situation in the 21st century had been different or less difficult than the 1990s after the collapse of the Soviet Union, but it still had been a period of crisis. It is important to say that the so-called special period had represented half of the history of the revolution. And as a result of that, you can say that there is a significant group of the population that see the necessity for seeking a response to the crisis outside the ideological framework that the founding generation of the political system had adopted. So what happened then? I think that a critical year is 2011, because after almost 14 years without celebrating its party congress, the Cuban Communist Party called the Sixth Party Congress in 2011 and basically adopted a program of reforms that are known in the context of Cuba as the lineamientos económicos y sociales del Partido Comunista de Cuba. O sea, they are called the general guidelines, the general social and economic guidelines for the Cuban Communist Party. I will call it the CCP from now in the current circumstances. And the idea, if you study the documents and the debate that surrounded the adoption of this document, was to adapt the political regime by seeking a new legitimacy by performance of the type that had been achieved in the countries of East Asia, the communist countries in East Asia, basically Vietnam and China. And the idea was for achieving this goal, the idea was to adopt a type of market, socialist market economy. To say it in different words, it will be a kind of mixed economy. And a big important part of this was to avoid the stigmatization of market and private property that was typical of the models before, of the Cuban economic model before, and also to break the separation, the isolation from of the state structures from the market and from the non-state sector. That is the phrase that the Cuban had used to refer to a private sector and also an important sector of cooperatives. What was the choice? The one choice was to go with a big bang reform, and other was to go for a gradual reform. The choice was clearly for a gradual reform. The idea was, and in my view was correct, that if you look at the experiences of dismantlement of command economies, those countries that went for a gradual path were able to do it more successfully. And also there was the strategic situation in which Cuba could not could not face a sudden disarray of its political and economic system, given the level of confrontation with the United States that had also important dimension at the level of the international financial institutions that in other cases were able to provide some type of caution with rescue packages to countries that engage in the transition. The most typical case is the case of Russia during the time of the Boris Yeltsin administration or something like that, or the support by the European Union to the transitions in East Germany and the countries in East Europe. So under this circumstance, there was a clear choice for gradualism. But something that we will notice is that beginning in 2011, by 2017, when the seven-party Congress, but 2016, when the seven-party Congress took place, it was clear that the party has been quite reluctant to assume and discuss the cause of an excessive gradualism that had made very difficult the necessary complementarity and interdependence between the different reforms. And according to its own central report by Raúl Castro to the seven-party Congress, by 5 years later, only 21% of the guidelines that were adopted by the six-party Congress were fulfilled, and there was also around another quarter of these guidelines that had been implemented only partially. So in terms of political economy, we need to take into account that we were entering into what some scholars of transition had called partial reform equilibrium. And partial reform equilibrium are in theory, and there is plenty of evidence, create important opportunities for rent seekers, corrupt behavior, assets divestment, and more important, it had very negative consequences. If gradualism, if it is done comprehensively, tend to reduce many of the cost of policy consequences. It allows some level of reversibility when certain decisions are not efficient. Well, excessive gradualism, particularly the conditions of partial reform equilibrium, create situations in which particularly inequality and problems of paralysis tend to be more accurate. So what is the key of the so-called ordenamiento? Ordenamiento could not be on this. Ordenamiento is the new phase of reforms, which the fundamental goal of breaking this partial equilibrium and create a dynamic that unleash the possibility of continue the transition to this type of legitimacy by performance, adopting a type of mixed economy that will allow the regime to adapt and, in this case, build a new zone of legitimacy based on a continuous improvement of the standard of living of the population. In this case, a big problem was the issue of the use of multiple currencies in the Cuban context and multiple exchange rates. Why? Because to be legitimate in the way the revolution paradigm has discussed the role of the state need to be entrepreneur, need to be a redistributive, and also need to develop a fiscal authority that did not exist before under the command economy and exists, but in a very limited and primitive way under the model of a command economy with segments of market-oriented sectors. And in this case, it's very difficult for any authority, any institution that try to pursue these three functions. I repeat, a redistributive authority, a fiscal authority, and also an entrepreneurial state. It is very difficult to do that when you have multiple exchange rates and multiple currencies living side by side, not as a two-track economy in a temporary way like it was the case in China, but for a long period of now since 1991 to 2021, almost 30 years. So what is the situation here? Is that you cannot manage, you cannot control, you cannot manage what you cannot measure. And basically, it was the way we can go to the theory of the firm, but the distortions created by this multiplicity of currencies and exchange rate affected the different companies, and I'm talking about state-owned companies, but also new companies or new firms in the emerging sector in a different way. And the potential possibilities of decentralization, let's remember that decentralization, more than privatization, was originally the early source of efficiency improvement in China through the town and villages enterprises, or let's say of better relations between non-state firms and state-owned companies in the context of a market-oriented economy are unthinkable and very difficult to have them when you have all this multiplicity of currencies. So a key element of the Ordenamiento project had been the idea of the devaluation. The official rate was devaluated 24 times because Cuba was using an artificial parity exchange of 1 peso, $1. And in this case, it is an action that it is very difficult to roll back and basically put the reforms under the constraint that it needs to move forward because it is very difficult that to roll back a measure like this one. Another important part of this is that in response to a measure like this one, the government was forced to take some caution measures to protect the labor force within the state. And there was a very big reform in terms of salaries and prices in ways that also force first, it create a more realistic level of relative prices and send signals to the different economic actors that is supposed to have an effect on their behavior, but also it create important inflationary pressures that politically can become a source of problems down the road in the country. This is basically what I want to say about the ordenamientos. What is the challenge here? Is that the ordenamiento action has been taken, the decision has been taken after a process of institutional change when Cuba adopted a new constitution that basically unlocked the possibility of creating a more robust private sector with a law about a small and medium-sized enterprise that's supposed to be discussed by April of 2022. What is the important dilemma, and here I'm going to finish, is that the moment to take these measures had been after the intergenerational transition at the top of the leadership from Raúl Castro to the new leader, Miguel Díaz-Canel, making the culture of leadership more difficult because if Fidel and Raúl used to have a type of leadership associated with a kind of being themselves a minimal winning coalition, today there is a culture in which the charisma of Miguel Díaz-Canel and also the role he played at the top of the Cuban state is more like a primus inter pares, a leader of the party with the support of the armed forces, but not with the charisma of Fidel Castro or with the aura of being a founder of the party and the armed forces that Raúl Castro enjoyed. And last but not least, it is very important to mention that that the measures, the ordenamiento, had taken place in a context in which the economic situation of the country had been more difficult because of Donald Trump's policy of sharpening or making the embargo more difficult with new 242 measures. No, it is not simple. It's, the Donald Trump administration adopted 242 new measures to make the embargo in the financial and commercial field more difficult, and also the decline of the Venezuelan economy, one of the main partners of Cuba, or at times the main partner in this project of the Bolivarian matrix, and last but not least, the pandemic of COVID that caused a decline of 11% in the Cuban gross domestic product in the last year. So I'm going to leave it here, and I'm ready to take questions.